Warning, this content is for entertainment and educational purposes only. This video is brought to you by First Detachment Nutrition. Battle tested, expert formulated. Use discount code AB10 at checkout for 10% off. All right, folks. Big Paul here today with Kurt Havens. We're going to talk about fats. The carbohydrate video, Kurt, was very popular. And I had a lot of requests for us to do the science of dietary fats. And we're going to talk about all things dietary fats today. So what's going on, Kurt?
Nothing, man. Thanks for having me on again. Yeah. The nutrition stuff seems to be a big hit.
Yeah, people like nutrition stuff. And there's a lot of bad information out there about nutrition and especially fats. There seems to be a cult of eating fats and not even understanding what they do. And the way I look at fats and any macro on a diet, it's a variable to be manipulated when you're doing a diet. And there are purposes that they serve. And we want to optimize our diet to produce the maximum results based on our goals. You may not want to be a 250-pound mass monster on stage. You may just want to be fit and healthy, but you have to understand how these things work if we are going to manipulate them and have an effective diet.
It's a tool just like carbs. It's just a different tool. It's a saw versus a hammer, whatever.
Right. So what are fats? Let's explain to people what fats are.
Well, I mean, they're lipids, the carbon chain, right? And it has hydrogen bonds. There's let's say there's four types. You have saturated, monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, and trans fats. Right? Is that the order you did it in? Okay. So, so in the simplest terms, basically a saturated fat just means it has all single bonds. It's entirely full and it has all single bonds, no double bonds. A monounsaturated fat just means it has one double bond. And a poly means it has more than one double bond. And they vary in length from all the way up to massive, like the essential fatty acids are really long. Technically, unsaturated fats like a poly or a mono have actually less calories than a saturated fat does, which is kind of misunderstood. So they average, like the FDA averages calories at 9 calories per gram for fat, but technically polyunsaturated fat will actually have less energy than that versus a saturated fat will have slightly more.
It's somewhere around 8, isn't it?
Yeah. They just round them to make it a nice even number.
Protein isn't exactly the same as carbohydrates either.
Totally. So the biggest downfall of a polyunsaturated fat because of the extra double bonds is it's more likely to turn rancid. So that's why you wouldn't cook with flaxseed oil, because you would destroy it as soon as you heated it, versus you could cook with butter, which is primarily a saturated fat. They tend to be a lot more durable under heat. And then you have what we call trans fats, which for a large degree are pretty much outlawed in the United States, but they still are in some trace amounts in some things like shortening and margarine. They play games. They use partially hydrogenated now instead of fully hydrogenated, but they're still going to cause the same metabolic harm, basically.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong. Trans fats are man-made, correct?
There are some natural ones. So actually CLA, conjugated linoleic acid, that guys use for fat loss, technically is a trans fat. There are a few that are naturally occurring, but most, are man-made. So what they do is they take, so a saturated fat, the physical properties of a saturated fat, it tends to be solid at room temperature, like butter is solid at room temperature. And a mono or a poly is generally liquid at room temperature. There are some exceptions, like avocado is the opposite. Coconut is the opposite, right? Coconut is mostly saturated fat and it's solid at room temperature. And avocado is solid at room temperature, but it's mostly monounsaturated fat. So those are the two examples of the opposites. What they do to make a trans fat or hydrogenated fat is they start with an unsaturated fat and they basically turn a cis to a trans. So that's a little bit of chemistry. So you have trans fat is where it's a rigid molecule. So they forced a polyunsaturated fat to be straight, similar to a saturated, and that's why it's solid at room temperature. So like margarine is solid at room temperature, even though it started as a liquid, as a polyunsaturated fat. And so they basically add double bonds at opposite sides. So naturally a polyunsaturated fat will have double bonds, but they'll be on the same side, and that causes the bend in the molecule. And if you alter it under heat, they basically flip the double bonds on opposite side, which straightens it out. And that's what you see there.
And trans fats, if I recall correctly, the reason they were made is because they last longer.
It's garbage. So because it's rigid like that, it doesn't really fit in our cells correctly. So then it causes all sorts of metabolic problems.
From what I recall, it just sort of hangs out in your body and screws things up, correct?
Yeah, it's really,
blocks your arteries.
Yeah, really horrible stuff.
But it makes really good pastries. You get nice fluffy pastries.
Yeah, and chewy cookies and all sorts of stuff. That's
chewy cookies. Yep. Yeah, it makes really good sweet stuff.
Yes. So you want to talk about like fat metabolism?
Yeah, hang on a second. Let's back up and talk about the sources we have in the various types. So saturated would be, animal products, mostly animal meats, right? Butter,
with the exception of coconut.
With the exception of coconut oil. Trans fats are manufactured, would be margarine, things like that. Monosaturated would be olive oil,
vegetable
oil, vegetables essentially. Polyunsaturated would be mostly like fish, things like that. Nuts, correct?
Yep. And yeah, like walnuts are high in polyunsaturated fats. People will probably be angry about it, but saturated fat really plays very little role in the human body outside of energy. They're way overconsumed. Like as a bodybuilder, you really don't need a whole lot, especially if you're enhanced. Natural guys probably need a little bit more fat, but still most people that I run into eat way too much dietary fat.
Yeah, I mean, the average American is not deficient in saturated fat. And that's another thing that people don't realize is that they all these stupid diets where people are eating sticks of butter and ribeyes and stuff. Saturated fat, probably outside of trans fat, is the biggest offender for screwing your cardiovascular system up, for causing arterial blockages and things like that. So especially when we're skewing lipids already with PEDs, you probably want to keep saturated fats to a minimum. I personally structure my diet where I keep the saturated fats as low as possible, and then I add in added fats to fill in the other columns.
Yeah, I do the same.
And that's how I structure my diet. But the saturated fats are going to be the ones that are going to kill you for the most part.
And they're used, and this has been studied ad nauseum for decades. And they know, and so even when we do studies now about weight gain, they typically use what they call a high fat diet in rats. So scientists know that if you want to fatten up an animal really fast, what you do is you give them a ton of saturated fat or high fat diet in general, right? They're generally not using a high carbohydrate diet to fatten up a rat because it doesn't really work.
All right, Gym Bros, I'm going to interrupt this regularly scheduled broadcast to tell you about the new Science of HGH ebook by Kurt Havens. It is available on the Anabolic Bodybuilding website for download right now. There is a link in the video description below for the ebook if you want to pick it up. It is probably the most comprehensive ebook about performance enhancement use with HGH, over 100 pages of information with references, and it's awesome. Go check it out. Let's talk about EFAs. We'll move on to EFAs. What EFAs are.
Yeah, so there's some misconception. So there's only technically 2 essential fatty acids. By definition, essential means that you cannot produce them. Our body cannot make them.
We have to get them from our diet.
You have to get them from food. Technically, the end product that your body's actually looking for on this chart is EPA and DHA. They're not technically considered EFAs because you technically can produce them. That being said, the production in a modern human is about 3%. So what are considered the essential fatty acids technically are listed here. The ALA and the LA, the alpha linoleic acid and the linoleic acid, are technically the essential fatty acids. They are 20 carbons long and 22, and the human body can't produce molecules that long. So you have to obtain those from your diet. And so where a lot of these dietary standards come from, when people say, you need 0.3% of your calories should come from fat. Where that comes from is that's with the assumption that the fat you're consuming contains an adequate amount of ALA and LA in order to produce the EPA and DHA. So it's not to say that you really need to consume that many calories from fat. It's just to make up for the lack of the 3% conversion, which is junk.
You can see it from here, how the process works. But most, from what I understand, most American diets are severely deficient in omega-3s.
Yeah. So you want, it ranges, scientists will disagree, but it should be somewhere about a 1-to-1 ratio, omega-3 to omega-6 to like 2-to-1, possibly 3-to-1. I think the last I saw was as horrible as the current diet is 56-to-1 omega-6 to omega-3.
Yeah, I saw a study that said it was around 50-1.
Yeah, which is really atrocious. So you wonder where there's a lot of diseases that can come out of this. There are a lot of inflammatory things. There are a lot of inflammatory things that cause disease, right? Cancer, Alzheimer's, those things are inflammatory diseases. And I'm not making any claim about curing cancer at all, but they should be kept in mind because your body's not in great shape if you're not consuming the right amount of fat and the right types of fat.
Yeah. Now backing up for a second, omega-3s are anti-inflammatory and omega-6s can be pro-inflammatory, correct?
They can. The omega-6 technically can be anti-inflammatory as well too. It just depends on the ratio.
The ratio, correct.
Yeah. So it's not just the fat itself that's going to do that. It's more how much of each, right? Because of the ALA and the LA, one is an omega-6 and the other is an omega-3. So your body technically needs both to live. Right. I think there's a lot of people in the fitness or nutrition space nowadays that preach against omega-6, right? This seed oil crowd.
Yeah.
That's not correct either. And not to go off on a tangent, but seed oil technically is not really a class of anything because you have things on varying scales. It's like you just making a statement that say all cars pollute, right?
Yeah. I've seen a lot of the
varying degree of
fitness influencers talking about seed oils kill.
Yeah.
I'm like, where are they getting this from?
I don't know. I would run the other direction if someone even mentions seed oils in a negative way. It's generally not the health issue that I would worry about.
There's so much in the fitness industry of monkey see, monkey do. People are just repeating stupid stuff that they've heard other people say, and they don't even understand how it works. I see that frequently.
Yeah. So just so people understand, I'm going to try to give some of the science overview without getting too confusing. So the term omega-3 just means it has a double bond 3 atoms away from the methyl group in the chain. So the terminal and the end of the molecule has a methyl group. And it means that there's a double bond 3 away. And that's where they come up with omega-3. And omega-6 is 6 away from that methyl group. That's just the name it doesn't really mean much more than that. It's just a way that scientists can identify a molecule.
And what are some good sources of omega-3s that we can add to our diets?
So if you're talking about the ALA and the LA, I use flaxseed oil. It contains both. I use ground flaxseed as well. Walnuts, probably some vegetable oils that actually I don't know.
Fish oil.
So then if you talk about then if you're talking specifically EPA and DHA, then fish oil really is the only source. You get some from grass-fed beef, but it's not usually enough. It's probably recommended that most people supplement with a couple grams of fish oil.
Yeah, I do fish, flax, and then I'll do some walnuts as well. I put some crushed walnuts in my oatmeal and it tastes good.
Yep.
All right, so let's we briefly talked about it earlier, Kurt, but let's dig into saturated fats a little bit and what role they really play in metabolism and how much of them do we really need?
Well, I mean, really on the surface, they're really just supplying energy.
Right,
to the human body. How many do you technically need? Technically, you wouldn't need any because the human body can produce saturated fat on its own, right? So the human body will produce all of the lipids it needs outside of ALA and LA. In that sense, you technically don't need any. That doesn't mean I'm not saying that people don't need to eat fat or you should have an entirely fat-free diet. I'm just saying from a purely biological point of view, there's technically no need for them.
Yeah, and I don't remember what the current recommendations were, but I think it was less than 20 grams per day.
Of saturated fat? Yeah. And I would probably try to eat, and again, for guys that are on anything, I would probably keep the number lower than that.
Yeah, but that's the issue you run into when you're on a bodybuilding diet from your meat sources. You are going to get some saturated fat. Totally. So, but I try to keep my food choices very lean. So there is a little bit of saturated fat in chicken breast. I'll do things like cod. Which doesn't really have any in it. There is some in ground beef, but I try to keep the ground beef as lean as possible, and then we'll sub in the other stuff. And really, just if we're eating carbohydrates, that saturated fat's not going to get used as energy, and just gets deposited as adipose.
Yep.
And we talked about it in the other video. You talked about it a bit, and this can be a segue into fat metabolism, but it just essentially is prepackaged and ready to be stored as fat.
I mean, and the same thing with carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are your body's primary source of energy. They're used pretty much immediately, and they go to the liver first and muscle glycogen versus dietary fat is already in the form it needs to go right into fat cells, right? So muscle cells really don't uptake a ton of saturated fat. It's in the single digit percent that it would be called intercellular triglycerides. Muscles don't generally store a ton. So when you eat, like let's say you eat, a stick of butter or even olive oil, whatever. So the digestion really starts in the intestines. The only thing that's absorbed in the stomach is alcohol. So it starts in the intestines, and you have things called lipases, which are enzymes that start to break it down. And then it turns into something called chyme. And then it breaks it down into what you would call free fatty acids. And those free fatty acids can then go through the intestinal wall because it's a smaller molecule. They can permeate the wall. And then once they're on the outside of the intestines in circulation, then they reform as triglycerides again. So they just have to unform and then reform in order to pass the intestines. Once they're in circulation, they form a vehicle called a phospholipid vehicle called cyclomicron, and that's how they circulate. And they enter the lymphatic system up here through what they call the thoracic duct. And it's already in that form that's going. Triglycerides are what gets stored inside of adipose tissue. So it's prepackaged. It has to travel in that cyclomicron because blood is water, right? It's like mixing salad dressing. So it has to float in that, but then they're basically just getting transported right to fat cells.
Yeah, if we're not in an energy deficit.
Yeah.
All right, so now we know what happens when we eat fat. How do we burn fat, Kurt? How does that happen?
Okay, well, I mean, technically the process is called beta oxidation because it's occurring through what they call the beta receptor on the fat cell. The alpha receptors are fat enters, and the beta receptors are fat can leave. So the alpha receptor, when people use things like yohimbine, that basically blocks the alpha receptor, so fat can't really enter a cell. Right. And then when you use something like clenbuterol, that stimulates the beta receptor, so fat can then leave.
So at the end of the day, it's net energy balance. We need to be in a calorie deficit to burn fat.
Yep. So I think where people get really confused is burning fat, right? People talk about the fat burning zone or a low carb diet where you're burning fat. Burning fat doesn't mean losing fat, right? The same as
two different things.
Yeah. Yeah. So what matters most is your being in a calorie deficit. So you will lose that stored energy when you're in a calorie deficit. You could technically be in ketosis, or on a super low carb diet and technically be running on fat and not lose any body weight, not lose any body
gain.
Fat. Yeah. Or gain fat. Yeah. And that's kind of where it gets, where people get very confused. Same with, so the more fat you eat, the more fat you store and the more fat you burn. But what really is going to affect fat loss is the total calories going in versus out, right? Same with carbohydrates. The more carbohydrates you eat, the more glucose you store as glycogen and the more glucose you burn. But that doesn't mean that you don't lose body fat doing that either, because if you're in a calorie deficit, your body's going to tap into body fat, right?
Yeah, and that's a misnomer I think that a lot of people have, is they think there's some magic to keto diets where they're going to lose fat at a more rapid rate than what they would with a regular carbohydrate based diet or whatnot. But at the end of the day, it is net energy balance. It's like a credit card. If you want to pay down your debt or lose that debt, you have to pay more on it than you're charging on it. So it's the same way with losing body fat. It's really, at the end of the day, it's just a math game. So even if you are, like you said, burning fat, that means that you're just using fat for energy. That doesn't mean you're actually losing fat.
Yeah. If you're replacing the fat in the cell as fast or faster than it's coming out, you're not going to lose any weight. It doesn't matter. It's not some insulin mediated thing too. So that's another thing. We talked about that in the carbohydrate video, but it's worth mentioning again. The insulin model of obesity has been disproven 20 or 30 years ago at this point. Insulin is not strong enough of a response that it's going to stop the process of fat loss, right? Bodybuilders wouldn't inject insulin if it were going to prevent them from getting leaner. They're not doing it to get fat.
I've been using insulin my entire contest prep.
Yeah.
And I am leaner.
Yep. It's not a when your insulin is out. So on a very basic level, technically where they got this from is in textbooks. When your insulin's elevated, your body's not really going to burn fat. But again, it goes back to energy balance. Your body will tap. If you are weightlifting and your diet contains protein and you're in a calorie deficit, your body is going to preferentially lose body fat, right? The substrate, whether glucose or fat used during exercise, is not necessarily what is going to dictate the outcome, right? So you could walk for 2 hours a day, right? And be in the technical fat burning zone and eat no carbohydrates. So you have no insulin. It doesn't mean you will lose any fat if you go home and eat 3 sticks of butter.
Right.
I think that this is where people get very confused. It has nothing to, the zone that you're in really has nothing to do with what your outcome is going to be. So, right, sprinters are leaner than marathon runners, and sprinters are only using creatine phosphate when they run, and some glucose. They're not using fat at all, but the other 23 hours a day, their body will use the opposite. And that's the same as like one of the reasons why weightlifting tends to burn some level of fat. It's not while you're in the gym picking up heavy things. It's the rest of the day. Your body will then preferentially burn fat because it learns over time that it wants to spare that glucose for the task at hand.
Yeah, it's saving the glucose for the gym.
Next session. Yep. So the body is otherwise we wouldn't have survived in the woods.
Yeah, and that's a trick of the energy management systems that I don't think people understand, like with when we do a carb cycling or have a high carb day. And this is and I'm sort of going back into the carb thing again, but it's worth mentioning is that you can actually be in a surplus on that high carb day and not deposit any fat because you're not burning any fat, but because you have glycogen stores, you're going to store those excess carbohydrates in glycogen for later use for your lifting and whatever other processes that are going to require glucose. So that's sort of a trick of the trade. And that's why carb cycling is an interesting approach. And I'm not saying it's the only approach, but it's an interesting approach to bodybuilding where you can actually be in a caloric surplus and not store any body fat during that day.
Yeah.
But so, that counts on you keeping your dietary fats extremely low.
Yeah. So I think where people go wrong. So we're talking about energy balance, right? And then we just said a statement that contradicts that. So we're not going against thermodynamics. It's if in a carb cycling diet like Paul's describing, you have low days, right? So you become depleted. So then the body will super compensate by being able to hold more carbohydrates, assuming that you're actually working out. And you can then on 1 or 2 days a week bring your carbohydrates to a place where it now throws your calorie balance where you're in a calorie surplus, but because carbohydrates don't readily become adipose tissue, they're not going to turn into body fat just like Paul was describing. So it's the only 1% of dietary carbohydrates can become body fat in a calorie excess. No calories ever stored as anything in a calorie deficit, right? So, no one stores glycogen in a calorie deficit. No one stores protein in a calorie deficit. People get very confused about that as well. In a deficit means you're not storing anything. In an excess, you are storing both fat, and muscle is a storage place as well.
Yeah, and a deficit is a catabolic state.
Yes, by nature. But losing fat is a catabolic state. So
correct. So this is, with the carb cycling diet, that is a strategic manipulation of the energy management systems. We know in thermodynamics that energy is neither created nor destroyed, only transferred. So those excess calories from the carbohydrates that you're eating that day, thermodynamics hasn't been violated. They're just being stored as glycogen for later use. Yep. So that's sort of the trick of the hand with the carb cycling diet versus like something with a high fat diet. You're not going to get that from, let's say, a keto diet. You're not going to be able to eat in a surplus on a day and store and not store fat.
Well, yeah, not store it where you want to store it.
Correct. Right. So that's where this has an advantage, where you could burn fat 6 days a week, do a high carb day, fill your glycogen back up, give your metabolism a boost, and have full glycogen stores and prevent muscle loss and increase performance in the gym. It's sort of a trick of the energy management systems of the body without violating thermodynamics.
Yep. Another interesting thing about if you run just a high fat diet is that dietary fat doesn't stimulate leptin release. So your body actually doesn't recognize fat as a calorie source, basically, to shut off your hunger. So there is something called CCK that's released when fat transports through the intestinal wall that will tell your brain that you ate something, but it doesn't have the same effect as leptin. So one of the reasons why pretty much everyone watching this can eat an entire jar of peanut butter in one sitting and not be full. But if I gave you the same amount of calories as that in rice, you would probably throw up.
Yep. Because
leptin will shut your appetite off.
Yeah, and that's another bro myth too, that guys talk about high fat diets making them feel fuller. It's just, it's probably the carbs that you're fat or the protein.
In your stomach longer, right? So fat can sit in your stomach for 3 hours before it'll pass through.
Right.
Right. So why you typically don't eat fat right before you lift. Like my pre-workout meal has no fat in it. Same with my post.
So does fat, that begs the question, what role does fat play in building muscle, if any?
So that's kind of a multifaceted thing. So as a general rule, it plays very little direct role. So saturated fat per se would play basically, in an ideal world, it would play no role. Your cell membranes, including your muscle cells, are made up of a phospholipid layer, meaning that part of that is made of fat. So the fat that you consume becomes part of that lipid layer. So if you consume a diet that's mostly saturated fat, your cells will have a lot of saturated fat in that phospholipid layer, which you don't really want because it's rigid. Like we looked at before, that molecule that was straight, then signals can't go in and out. So hormones the androgen receptor can't really make its way fully to the surface, right? Insulin can't really push glucose in there anymore.
Yeah, it seems to be a huge contributor to insulin resistance.
Yep. So the newest stuff on insulin resistance shows that a high fat diet actually contributes more to type 2 diabetes than it does a high carbohydrate diet.
Probably more so high saturated fat, right?
Yeah, specifically that. So the only exception I would say there is the omega-3 fatty acids. EPA and DHA play a huge role in muscle building. They're the only non-hormone or non-protein substance that can actually stimulate mTOR. So eating fish oil technically is anabolic. What that mTOR does on its own, probably not much, but it's contributing to a greater picture. And it makes your cell membrane much more pliable, so things can go in and out of it much easier.
And that's why I construct diets with supplementing in added EFAs.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, it just makes sense. Again, neither of us are talking bad about eating any amount of fat. It's just being wise with your fat choices and your fat timing, right? You typically wouldn't eat, like on a high day, you minimize your fat consumption. And also you don't need a ton of fat with any meal that contains a ton of carbohydrates. And you don't also need a ton of fat around exercise. It doesn't make any sense. It's not what your body's looking for.
Yeah, and that's another thing I wanted to touch on real quick. Guys seem to be confused about this one too, is the being cautious mixing high fats with high carbs. Why that's a bad thing for body composition. I don't think dudes fully understand what's going on there, but your body's going to prioritize glucose as an energy source first.
Always.
Right. So if we have any excess fats in the body at that time, they're not going to be used for energy, and there's only one place they can be stored.
And that's not where you want it.
Right. So it's a bad idea to mix high carbs and high fats. You need a little bit, but it's, especially on the high carbohydrate day, when we're in that surplus, like we talked about, it is in that energy balance at the end of the day. So if we are in a surplus, it's probably even more important to keep the fats low.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, no, definitely, because the body's always going to prioritize outside of sleep or a super low blood sugar state. It's going to always prefer to use carbohydrates. Like certain cells, like your red blood cells, can't use anything but glucose.
I see these dumbasses that add a lot of fats into their off-season diets, and it's just a recipe for getting fat when you're in a surplus.
And insulin resistant, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so a lot of times the insulin resistance that people are getting, they're blaming the carbohydrates for. It's probably the excess consumption of saturated fats that's really the major contributor to it.
Yep.
I would assume.
Yeah. And so an interesting point too is humans can convert excess glucose to fatty acids, right? So we talked about that before. The percent of conversion is very low. So it's not like, I know of no one that's gotten fat off eating rice or fruit or potatoes, but the human body cannot turn fatty acids into glucose. We lack the enzyme to convert what they call acetyl coenzyme A, which is the top of the Krebs cycle, how energy is created, into pyruvate. So the human body doesn't work that way. So you're not going to create glucose from fat per se. You can cleave a triglyceride is 3 fatty acids with a glycerol like backbone. You can cleave that off and turn the glycerol into glucose, but that's a very long process and it's not efficient. But you can't actually turn that fat into glucose to run your body on. What your body's going to do is going to destroy muscle in order to make that glucose that it needs.
Yeah, gluconeogenesis.
Yeah, which you don't want to occur.
Yeah, we don't want to break proteins down for glucose. Anybody that's run a low carb diet can attest to that. It's funny, Kurt. I just had a guy who brought on as a client who was running keto. And 1 week into it, I had him doing carbs, and he was talking about how he had performed better in the gym than he's ever performed in his life. And he's like I can't. He's like, this is like shocking to me that it was like a revelation to him that he was doing CrossFit, and how he said he said he felt like he could do 2 classes back to back. And I'm like, dude,
because you had energy, right?
You actually had energy. You actually had gas in the tank. Your gas tank was empty before. You probably felt miserable at the end of that class.
I can't imagine trying to do something like CrossFit on that. I coach a highly competitive CrossFit athlete. I'm not sure if he's at the professional level or not, but he's like a ranked, and the amount of carbohydrates that we feed him is absurd in order to get through his workouts. I mean, he must train 20 hours a week minimum.
So how much fat do we really need in our diet? I mean, what is optimal? I've always kind of gone with the 0.3 grams. I mean, I looked up the studies, and they're saying the American, I think it was Association of Sports Science or whatever, said for athletes that it's 0.5 to 1.5 grams per kilogram. So that lines up almost exactly to where I have it. I go with 0.25 grams per pound of body weight. It's usually where I have it. I keep fats fairly low, and I supplement in EFAs. I probably need to pay more attention to the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3.
Yeah.
You know, if I really wanted to get detailed with it, but I haven't gotten that detailed with it myself. But how much do you believe we typically need in our diet?
So the data, somewhere between, they're saying for hormone production and some immune system function and other processes that fats needed for, somewhere between 0.25 and 0.3 a day, which you and I probably get just as a product of meat consumption. Even eating lean meat, you're probably consuming somewhere near that. I don't ever really add, at this point with my carbs so high, I'm not really adding any fat outside of flax and fish oil to my diet. And for a natural athlete, I would probably strive for like a quarter of your calories, 0.25, versus, an enhanced lifter could get by on less than that because they're already giving themselves all the stuff that cholesterol is going to make, basically. Right. So it's the cholesterol actually that matters more than the fat. It's just that they're grouped together when they're transported in the blood. So that's kind of where that thing came from. It's not that the human body needs some, this massive amount of fat to run on, right? Most people have hundreds of thousands of calories stored in their body as fat, not deficient.
Right. And so you can explain it, but so people know that cholesterol is the precursor for all steroidal hormones in the human body. So it's basically steroidal hormones are made from cholesterol, correct?
Yep. I am. But again, you make, unless you have another issue, you would produce adequate cholesterol in your liver.
I don't see anybody coming to me with blood panels where they're deficient on cholesterol.
No, not going to happen. Well, your liver is going to do an adequate job producing. Honestly, most people are probably high. So,
yeah. And I think a lot of bros get obsessed. I talk to guys all the time. Well, you need fats for hormone production and for performance in the gym. They get obsessed with that. And I'm like, dude, you're getting your hormones from a 22 gauge needle. You don't need, and the amount that you need is so minuscule. I mean, it's single digits.
Yeah. I mean, you and I talked about it once. I always forget to look for the study, but there was one that showed that it was literally like 7 grams a day is what was needed for life, like to actually live, assuming that you was consuming the essential fatty acids. Right.
Yeah.
It's minuscule.
Now, essential fatty acids do play a role in immune health, and there's for vitamin transport, correct? That is also an important thing to touch on as well. You do need some EFAs.
Yeah. And so there's some differences too with the EFAs. Do you want me to go into like?
Sure. Yeah. Let's talk about it.
So so really the end product is DHA and EPA. So your brain is 60% fat, and a large majority of that is DHA. So if you're not consuming fish or fish oil in an adequate amount, it would make me question what your brain is actually made of, because that's actually essential for your brain. That's why newborn babies use this for the brain to form, and they'll pull it from the mother. Like the mother doesn't eat adequate DHA, the baby will be deficient, but it will still leach some out of her own body to make up a small amount of that.
Where's it leaching from?
Yeah, exactly. So DHA and EPA, for most people, they should be taking both. As pharmaceutical drugs, they isolate them and they sell them separately. I'm not sure why they do that. They both play similar roles, but also very separate roles. So DHA will block 4 types of inflammatory responses. EPA blocks 1, but that one that it blocks tends to have a stronger response. So like if you're very inflamed, EPA is going to be slightly more important. For men, DHA seems to be more important. The higher someone's testosterone is, the more the need for DHA increases. It also blocks something called produces something called GLA, which blocks the inflammatory response. Your cell membranes, like I discussed earlier, should ideally be made from these essential fatty acids. Your synapses, the myelin sheath cannot be penetrated, but the rest of the nerve cell ideally has essential fatty acids in it to protect them. So it actually improves like your nerve function in your central nervous system. You have something called lipid rafts, which are fat molecules that float in your blood, and they transport things like cancer. And so they found that DHA actually destroys the lipid raft. So again, I'm not making claims about anti-cancer, but if your fish oil level in your blood is high enough, it destroys these things that are transporting cancer, so cancer can't go anywhere. And then your T cells can actually attack the cancer. So your immune system can't attack cancer if it's on a lipid raft. It's like a shark trying to get you in a gigantic boat. It can't get to you. But if you're swimming, it can easily eat you. Both of them lower triglycerides. There's no EPA in the brain, but there is DHA in the brain. EPA is similar to COX-2 inhibitors like aspirin. So it actually has a very similar effect. But they've done studies where they put them head to head and they have the same outcome. So if you have a sensitive stomach or you can't take aspirin, if you took more fish oil, it reduces pain and inflammation in a very similar way.
Fish oil does some pretty miraculous stuff. Yeah. I will say I've had the experience myself where I took too much and I ended up having bleeds.
Yeah.
So that's just a forewarning. I had a surgery done one time where I was taking like 12 grams of fish oil a day, 12, 15, something like that. It was a lot. And I had a bleed after a surgery.
Yeah. I've had a hematoma before I pushed the level too high. But there's, for most people, if you take 3 to 4 grams combined, the two, that's plenty. I probably took 7 or 8 grams when I got a hematoma. Surgery is going to change a little bit too. You should just let your anesthesiologist know if you're going into surgery and you're taking stuff like that.
Yeah. So forewarning, stop taking fish oil before you get surgery done.
It's actually EPA specifically that thins the blood. DHA does not.
Yeah. So I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah. But again, like you can't really get DHA. It's not as easily found separately. So.
So like sort of summing this all up for bodybuilders, we'll go back to the bodybuilding purpose here. We do need some fats. It's very minimal. I saw a study, Kurt, and I talked about it. I forgot to clip the excerpt from it, but I wish I had it up here. But they were talking about where people actually lost muscle tissue on keto.
It's not surprising. I mean, you have no glycogen.
You have no glycogen, yes. And so it was they compared it to a high carbohydrate diet to a keto diet over a 12 or 16 week period of time. And the people on the keto diet actually atrophied.
Yeah, that's, again, not surprising. I mean, muscle's 75% water. The way the water gets in there is it's attached to carbohydrates as the form of glycogen. You have no glycogen. Yeah. And a dry muscle is not an anabolic muscle.
No. So it was interesting to see that. So, and I'm not trying to smash keto. I think it does have some purpose sometimes, if you have maybe somebody who has severe metabolic disorder, but it really is sort of a silly diet for bodybuilding. It is not best for optimizing yourself for bodybuilding performance. Definitely. So I would say a higher carbohydrate, moderate protein, low fat, high in EFAs is what we want. We want to keep saturated fat as low as possible. Especially with being on PEDs, we want to manage our cardiovascular health and keep our lipids in order. So keeping the saturated fat low is going to help there. Yeah. And just enough EFAs to get the job done. And then we fill the rest of the puzzle in with carbohydrates and protein.
Yep.
That's really the formula, folks. That's what works. And I've seen it over and over and over again with my clients. When I shift people to this, they'll tell me that they never thought they could eat so many carbohydrates and stay lean. They actually get leaner. Now, we do have to run a calorie deficit to get the fat off, but usually what I do once I have the fat off is that we'll start pushing the carbs back up and get them in a state of glycogen synthesis and having them fill back out. And it's interesting to see they'll put weight back on and not gain body fat.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Any parting words for the audience?
No, I mean, if people have questions, they want more videos, I mean, they can comment below. we'll do, we're going to start to do more nutrition stuff, right?
Yep.
Some exercise stuff, some nutrition stuff.
Yeah, well, we'll keep on the PED stuff too because it's interesting. But yeah, I would like to do more nutrition stuff. I think that it's funny. People get obsessed with the PED stuff, and really nutrition is where I see breakthroughs happen when people actually get their diets dialed in. Is when they actually start progressing. It is, and I'm not saying the PEDs don't work. Please don't take me as saying that. But as part of the puzzle, I think nutrition is the most important part.
Yeah, 100%.
Get your diet dialed in, your PEDs, what you need to get the job done, and then train hard, and that's how you grow and get big.
Absolutely.
Folks, if you want to get a hold of Kurt for coaching, it's what is it? Atomic Life.
AtomicLifeCoaching.com.
And I will have a link to Kurt's information in the video description below. And I appreciate each and every one of you watching. Take care.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
For coaching or consultations, head over to www.anabolicbodybuilding.com to book your spot today. I can help you with optimizing hormones, fat loss, muscle gain, physique, athletic performance, nutrition, and health. For more information, shoot me an email at bigp3rd@gmail.com.